Okay, so hi everyone. I think we'll just get started. It's 11 o'clock. So my name is Lin, and I'm from the Center of Teaching and Learning Pedagogy. So this is one of our teaching and learning webinar. So our center is under Inspire, and so today's webinar we have a very interesting topic. Called Inclusive Pedagogy from a Student's Perspective, Insight from Singapore Higher Education. And we have our two speakers, Daniel Teo and Dr. Darren Yeo here to give us this talk. So I just want to share a little bit about this webinar. So it presents findings from a survey of 192 NTU undergraduates, and I believe that a new skill was developed in the process of this study. And what is interesting about this study is that it explore students' perspectives on inclusive pedagogy, and that this study is actually part of a mixed method project that is supported by CTLP's EdeX Faculty Learning Communities grant. And this FLC comprises 8 faculty and staff across NTU, as well as I think there was involvement of 2 students who were very, hardworking and a great source of support. Okay, so maybe before I introduce the speaker, let me just run through some housekeeping matters. Okay, so this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared at this particular YouTube link. We will have 40 minutes of presentation and 15 minutes or so of Q&A, and please use the hand raise function. During the webinar, if you have any questions or comments, you can type in the chat. Our colleagues Vinay and Yun-Yi here with me will be keeping track of the comments on the chat, and we'll surface them during the Q&A. Okay. Meanwhile, just do a bit of plug. So you can join our Inspire social media to keep yourself updated on some of the latest teaching and learning news, I suppose. And at the end, we'll share this QR code again at the end, but we do want your feedback. So thank you very much for that. Okay, I believe it's in the chat now. So let me just head straight to sharing about our speakers. So Daniel Teo, he's a researcher at NTU's Aging Research Institute for Society and Education, ARISE. His work uses a narrative lens and to explore how people construct meanings with stories. He has published on health communication within marginalized communities in Singapore, and his research work also spans arts and theatre, and in recent times, adult AI literacy in higher education. Okay, Dr. Darren Yeo is an assistant professor in the psychology division at NTU, and he's also the director of Numera Lab. His work bridges cognitive psychology and education, and looking at learning strategies, cognitive processes, and memory. And in recent times, his work has evolved towards a broader focus on inclusive education and pedagogy, and he aims to make higher education accessible and effective for all learners. So I think without further ado, I'll invite Daniel and Darren to start sharing. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lynn, for the lovely introduction. Thank you, everyone else, for being here. So my name is Dan, and along with my colleague Darren, we're excited to share findings from our study on inclusive pedagogy in higher education. Our focus today is on the student's perspective, because while universities often talk about inclusion in policy or from the instructor's standpoint, much less is known about how students themselves actually experience inclusion or exclusion in their day-to-day learning environments. So over the next 35 minutes or so, we'll be walking you through the context of inclusive pedagogy globally and in Singapore, introduce a scale that we developed to measure student perceptions, and share what we learned from what makes students feel included or excluded in the classroom. And then I'll close with some takeaways and practical reflections that I hope will resonate with all of us as educators and researchers. Before diving into the study, I want to take a moment to acknowledge... Oops. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the wonderful team behind this project, led by Dr. Mukta Bansal, the principal investigator of this grant. This work was very much a collaborative effort spanning colleagues from psychology, education, social sciences, and university well-being. As you can see, it really took a cross-disciplinary village. I'd like to especially note that our research assistants and collaborators from NTU and beyond played key roles in data collection, analysis, and conceptual discussions. Without this team, we simply couldn't have carried the project through to completion. And of course, a special shout out to Lean for suggesting this webinar to share our findings. The study was supported by the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Pedagogy's EdeX Faculty Learning Communities grant, which gave us the space and resources to work together on this topic. So Darren and I are presenting on behalf of the team today, but what we share reflects our collective efforts. But before we truly start, I'd love to start by hearing from everyone here. So when you think of the word inclusion in the context of higher education, what's the first word that comes to mind? It could be an idea, a value, or maybe even a challenge you've encountered. So there's a poll that we set up. You can either access it by scanning the QR code on the screen, or I'm about to put up a link. Oh, Darren has put it up already. So we'll take a few minutes. Just think of the first word that comes to mind when you think of the word inclusion. Please don't use the word inclusion or any of the variations of inclusion. Okay, okay, Darren, I think we have enough time. Yeah, why don't we just see what people have said?
Okay.
Okay, 25 of you have
So
voted.
25. Yeah. Okay, so let's.
Very nice. Okay, so as we can see, the dominant word, the most frequent word is equity, followed by belonging, followed by diversity. So very values-driven words. It's very similar to what we encountered because we asked a very similar question to the students, and they also came up with very similar words. So I think that would be a nice parallel to what I'm going to be sharing very shortly. Does anyone else want to contribute? If not, I think we can continue. You can continue adding to the poll if you wish throughout the presentation. I think we can move on now. Yeah. Yeah, okay, thanks, Darren. So thanks again for sharing all your words. We can see that there's quite a wide variety of what we think inclusion means, and that's precisely what our research set out to explore. We wanted to understand this question: what does it mean for students to feel included in university classrooms? Because while many of us as educators and researchers think about inclusion in terms of policy frameworks or teaching strategies, what's often missing is the student perspective. How do they interpret inclusion? What makes them feel welcome, respected, and supported? And or, on the flip side, excluded? This guiding question runs through the entire study we'll be presenting today, and it's where we begin. Let's set the stage. So the world right now is at a crossroads when it comes to equity and inclusion. Across countries like the US, UK, and Australia, we've seen diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives come under political threat. Just last week, for instance, there were anti-migration protests in Australia, a reminder that inclusion is not a settled issue, but one that's constantly being contested. At the same time, higher education itself is growing more diverse than ever. Our classrooms now bring together students from different nationalities, languages, socioeconomic backgrounds, and learning needs. That diversity is both a tremendous resource and also a challenge. So the question is, how do we move beyond inclusion as a policy buzzword and instead make sure that inclusion is genuinely enacted in the day-to-day realities of teaching and learning? According to colleagues Stanford and Katsouris, the answer is inclusive pedagogy, which they describe as the deliberate design of learning environments that can accommodate diverse identities, backgrounds, and needs. Crucially, in inclusive pedagogy, difference is not a problem to be fixed. It's a resource for teaching and learning. In other words, inclusion is not about lowering standards or making compensations. It's about creating learning environments that actively value and harness diversity. This perspective shifts us from thinking about inclusion as merely placement and integration to thinking about it as environments, systems, and practices that create and sustain belonging. And before we go any further, I want us to pause on this idea of belonging. It's something we all know instinctively, whether it's in a classroom, at work, among friends, or even in a family gathering. We can all recall moments when we felt recognized and welcome, and also moments when we felt invisible or out of place. That's why talking about this today is really important. Next slide, please. The idea of inclusion in education has a long history, but it began very much in relation to students with special education needs. The Salamanca Statement in 1994 was a landmark moment, calling for their integration into mainstream schools. But what became clear over time was that access alone, simply placing students into classrooms, does not guarantee meaningful participation. Scholars like Lanny Florian argue that diversity needs to be designed from the very start, not treated as an afterthought. And this has given rise to the principle that diversity should be seen as normative. In other words, it's not an exception to accommodate, it's the very foundation on which we should design learning. This is the shift from thinking about inclusive education as placement to inclusive pedagogy as practice. Here's the missing piece in much of the existing research on inclusive pedagogy, the student voice. Most studies, focus on instructors, their beliefs, their practices, their challenges. That work is important, but it risks framing inclusion as something done for students rather than with them. Too often, students are treated as passive recipients of inclusive initiatives. Cook-Sather calls this out as early as 2006, describing how institutions may gather student feedback but stop short of recognizing students as co-constructors of inclusion. More recent studies, though, are starting to shift this narrative, showing us that students' lived experiences and reflections on belonging can transform how we understand inclusion. That's where our study enters the picture, to center student voices in the Singaporean higher education context. In Singapore, inclusion has mainly been framed through special education needs. About 80% of SEN students are in mainstream schools, with national initiatives focusing on access and integration, such as the Enabling Master Plan. These efforts are important, but they also mean inclusion is often equated with disability support, rather than wider diversity of university classrooms, including things like nationality, language, background, and learning styles. In higher education, pedagogy hasn't fully caught up. Meritocracy and internationalization shape universities, but diversity is not always met with inclusive teaching. DEI initiatives exist, but they're often fragmented, more about student life than classroom practice. And it's this gap between policy aspirations and pedagogy that motivated our study. And this is where our study comes in. To our knowledge, it's the first empirical investigation of inclusive pedagogy from the student perspective in Singapore higher education, open to all students, not just those with SEN. Most past work has focused on policy or instructors, but what's missing is how students themselves interpret and live inclusion. That matters because inclusion isn't only designed at the institutional or teaching level, it's also felt and enacted in everyday student experiences. To document that voice, we developed a new instrument and used it to examine 4 dimensions of learning environment: instructors, courses, classmates, and self. We asked how students define inclusion and how they perceive it across these dimensions and what moments of inclusion and exclusion they've experienced. Taken together, these questions help us build a grounded relational framework for inclusive pedagogy from the student perspective. I'll now let Darren take you through what we did to answer these questions that you see on the screen right now.
Thanks, Dan. So let me briefly show you what our survey looked like. It has 5 main components. First, a word association item, where students gave us the first 3 words they connected with inclusion. Next, a second rating question, a single rating question, where students indicate how included they felt in campus learning environments, similar to an overall thermometer. And third, we have a 38-item instrument we developed to measure perceptions across instructors, courses, classmates, and self, which we named Student-Centered Perceptions of Pedagogical Experiences Scale, or SCOPE for short. Then we have a set of questions on students' own experiences, and finally, demographic information. So altogether, this gave us both structured data and open-ended insights into how students think and feel about inclusion. So looking through the literature, we realized very quickly that existing instruments weren't going to work for our purpose. Most of them were either designed for K-12 settings, focused primarily on teachers' behavior, or not really relevant in the Singaporean higher education context. So we started with a large pool of 141 items, drawing from 8 established instruments, and then sorted and refined them into 4 dimensions: instructors, classmates, courses, and self. And through multiple rounds of review, including feedback from fellow instructors and students, we reduced the list down to 38 items that made sense for our context, both linguistically and conceptually. And the result was a scale with strong face and content validity, designed to capture how students themselves perceive inclusion across different aspects of their learning environment. To give you a sense of what the scope items look like, in the instructors dimension, students rated whether their lecturers showed fairness and respect across differences. In the causes dimension, we asked whether diverse perspectives and experiences were incorporated into the curriculum. For classmates, items captured how peers acknowledge diversity and its impact on the learning environment. And in the self dimension, students reflected on whether their own viewpoints were recognized in class. Together, these examples show that the scale doesn't just focus on what instructors do, but also on causes, peer dynamics, and students' own sense of voice. So who took part in the study? We recruited both undergraduate and graduate students from across NTU, and participation was open to both full-time and part-time students across different years and disciplines. And here's a snapshot of our participants. So we had 192 students, aged between 19 and 35, with an average age of about 22 and a half. The sample was majority Chinese, which reflects Singapore's broader demographics, with Indian, Malay, and other ethnicities represented as well. And in terms of gender, just over half identified as female, a little under half as male, and a small number identified as non-binary, transgender, or preferred not to say. So while diverse, the sample does lean toward majority groups. We also had good representation across years of undergraduate study, with year 2 being the largest group, and there were only 2 postgraduates who took part in this study. And as you can see from the majors chart on the right, our sample was skewed towards engineering and the sciences, with fewer students from the humanities and social sciences, business, and arts. This means that the findings that you will see shortly may reflect slightly more of a STEM perspective, but we did capture voices from across the university. To analyze the data, we used a combination of quantitative and qualitative techniques. On the quantitative side, we conducted confirmatory factor analysis to validate the scale, frequency analysis of count data, and then used a non-parametric test to compare between factors or across groups. And on the qualitative side, we coded the word associations and open-ended responses, conducted thematic analysis to identify recurring patterns, and used rapid qualitative analysis to extract actionable recommendations from students' suggestions. I won't go into the statistical details here, but the key point is that we combined both breadth and depth, robust measurement alongside rich insights from students' own voices, words, and voices. So what did we learn? So let's begin with something very simple and very revealing. When students at NTU hear the word inclusion, what comes to mind first? And that's what you did at the start of this seminar. So altogether, we collected over 570 words. And what you're seeing here is a word cloud, where the size of each word reflects how frequently it was mentioned. So you notice here that diversity dominates, followed by terms like fairness, race, international, and academics. And we grouped similar terms together. So early on in our poll, equity was one of the words that was most frequently mentioned, and we grouped that under fairness, alongside synonymous terms like equality, fairness, equity, and all. So we have fairness, race, international, and academics, right? As frequently mentioned words. Other words such as accessibility, respect, and belonging also feature prominently. This shows that students are associating inclusion not only with values of justice and fairness, but also with very concrete aspects of campus life, like internationalization, peer relations, and the academic environment. And what stands out is that students view inclusion in both value-driven terms, like fairness and respect, similar to what most of you mentioned earlier, and in socially anchored terms like race, internationalization, and peer relations. So they're not just talking about abstract ideals, they are linking inclusion directly to their everyday campus experience. Taken together, these responses suggest that for students, inclusion is multifaceted. It's about values, but it's also about lived realities. Who's in the classroom, how diversity is treated, and whether respect and accessibility are present. So when we ask students to rate how included they generally felt in their learning environments, the responses were quite positive overall. So on a scale of 1 to 7, the median rating was 6 out of 7, which suggests that most students felt at least somewhat, if not strongly, included. However, an overall perception doesn't inform us about the dimensions that make students feel less included. And that is where the scale we developed proves helpful. When we break it down by dimension using the scope scale, all dimensions were perceived positively, evidenced by the median rating above the neutral point of 4. But there were some interesting differences that emerged. So students rated themselves highest. In other words, their own sense of voice and comfort mattered most. However, this was followed closely by and not significantly different from their perceptions of instructors. And classmates were rated significantly lower than instructors, and courses came out lowest. What this tells us is that interpersonal aspects of inclusion, the relationship with instructors and peers, and students' own confidence in participating are stronger than structural or curricular ones. Course design, content, and assessment practices seem to lag behind relational inclusion. To dig deeper, we ran regression analysis to see which of the 4 dimensions actually predicted students' overall sense of inclusion. What we found was striking. 2 dimensions stood out: self and instructors. So students' own self-efficacy, their confidence, their sense of voice, their comfort in the classroom was the strongest predictor by far. The care and inclusivity of instructors also made a significant difference. And interestingly, course and classmates, while important in descriptive terms, were not significant predictors in a model. In other words, the structure of the course and even peer dynamics mattered less, statistically speaking, than how students felt about themselves and how they were treated by their instructors. These findings highlight the central role of both student self-efficacy and instructor care in shaping perceptions of inclusion. We also looked at whether perceptions of inclusion varied by student background, and a few clear patterns emerged. First-year students tended to report lower perceptions of inclusion in courses, in relation to classmates, and even in their own self-perceptions compared to senior students. STEM students, on the other hand, actually expressed slightly higher self-perceptions and overall inclusion compared to non-STEM peers. And international students rated instructors less positively than local students, suggesting that cultural or linguistic dynamics may be at play. These results suggest that inclusion is not evenly experienced across the board. It varies depending on the year of study, discipline, and student background. Next, we also asked students to rank the 3 factors that most shaped their sense of inclusion. And the number 1 factor was by far was classmates, particularly peer inclusion. And this was followed by positive classroom experiences more broadly and a welcoming classroom environment. Instructor care and students' own confidence also featured prominently. What this shows is that while institutional structures matter, students experience inclusion most directly through their immediate relationships with peers and with instructors who set the classroom tone. On the flip side, when students were asked what made them feel excluded, the results are strikingly consistent. The top 3 factors were uncooperative peers, lack of interaction with peers, and feeling that their participation was not valued. Again, notice the pattern. Exclusion is not usually experienced through overt discrimination, but through subtle dynamics of disengagement, being ignored, left out of cliques, or sidelined in group work. What really comes through in both the inclusion and exclusion data is the central role of peers. On the positive side, classmates can be the strongest source of inclusion. Students talked about moments when peers actively invited their contributions, respected their perspectives, and created a sense of camaraderie in group projects. These small gestures of acknowledgement made them feel they belonged. But the reverse was also true. When peers were uncooperative, cliquish, or dismissive, students felt excluded, sometimes more than anything an instructor might say or do. And being ignored in group discussions or feeling left out of informal peer networks was enough to undermine their sense of belonging. So peer dynamics are really a double-edged sword. It can either be the most powerful driver of inclusion or the most painful source of exclusion. And I'll let Dan take you through the rest of the findings and how we've made sense of them.
Okay, thanks, Darren. These next set of insights come from the open-ended questions in our survey, where students could describe moments when they felt included in an open-ended fashion. So we captured 103 responses on inclusion and 47 responses on exclusion, or 150 answers in total if you're doing mental sums. Peers were the most frequently mentioned source of inclusion and exclusion. Students felt included when classmates acknowledged them or invited their views. As one said, "I did not speak up, but some members took the initiative to ask for my opinion." When peers were exclusionary, the students brought up cliques, silencing, and being ignored in group work. One student put it plainly, "I wasn't heard during discussions. It made me afraid to speak up because I know they won't respond." Instructors too shaped the classroom climate. Inclusion was fostered when they created safe dialogic spaces and showed patience. "Some professors are really patient in explaining stuff," said one of the students. This makes me feel included and part of the class." But exclusion arose when students perceived dismissiveness, favoritism, or inaccessible communication. As one of the responses goes, "Most professors still think asking for extensions due to bad mental health is an excuse, so I have to fake being physically sick." Beyond peers and instructors, students also pointed to courses and self. They highlighted small seminars and flexible formats, gave them confidence. They mentioned barriers too, like cultural and linguistic challenges, even some instances of casual racism. And structural issues such as large classes, fast delivery, and weak institutional support reinforced exclusion. Next slide, please. So to pull together what we just heard from the open-ended responses, first, peers are pivotal, again. Collaboration and mutual respect foster belonging, but cliques and silence drives exclusion. Peers really are, again, just to reiterate what Darren has said, that double-edged sword we saw earlier. Second, instructors shape the classroom climate. Patience, empathy, active listening promote inclusion, while dismissiveness and perceived favoritism undermine it. Taken together, these accounts show that inclusion is deeply relational and effective, about being actively seen, heard, and valued, while exclusion often takes the form of silence, neglect, or unresponsiveness. Inclusion is not just about policies or teaching techniques. It's about the everyday relational conditions that either open doors or quietly shuts them. And finally, one of the most valuable parts of the survey was simply asking students directly, what should instructors start doing, continue doing, and stop doing to make classrooms more inclusive? So the responses converged on some clear themes. In terms of what to start doing, students wanted instructors to be more proactive, checking in with them, sharing personal experiences to humanize the classroom, using diverse teaching tools, and inviting participation from the quieter students. From what to continue doing, they strongly valued empathy and fairness, providing accessible materials like recorded lectures and captions, creating opportunities for an anonymous or low-stakes participation. These practices made them feel safe to contribute. And when it comes to what they should stop doing, students pointed to three main things: making assumptions about their backgrounds, discouraging participation by selectively engaging only certain students, and relying on outdated, fast-paced, or inaccessible practices. What we find powerful here is that these are not abstract ideals. They're highly practical, day-to-day teaching behaviors that students do notice, and that makes all the difference between feeling included or excluded. So like any study, ours has some limitations. As Darren shared earlier, our sample, while sufficient for the analyses, was skewed towards STEM and majority groups, which meant we had fewer insights from marginalized students, including those with disabilities or minority backgrounds. But to address this limitation, we have a phase 2 of this study in which we conducted a set of in-depth interviews, but those results will be shared on a separate occasion. The study was also conducted at a single research-intense university in Singapore. I wonder which one. That provides useful insights into one context, but it does limit generalizability to other types of institutions or national systems. And finally, the cross-sectional design means we captured perceptions at one point in time, but not how they might shift over time or in response to specific interventions. So for the future, we see opportunities to oversample marginalized groups, to conduct cross-institutional comparisons in Asia and beyond, and to use longitudinal design that can capture how inclusion evolves with changing pedagogical practices. Okay, I know that was a lot to take in, so let's quickly recap what our study uncovered. So first, our results show clearly that inclusion is driven by relational dynamics. Instructors and students' own self-perceptions most strongly predict overall feelings of inclusion, while courses and peers play weaker roles statistically speaking. Courses, in fact, were consistently rated lowest, pointing to what we term as a structural lag. Interpersonal inclusion is improving. Students feel supported by instructors and by their own growing confidence. But course design and assessment practices are not yet as responsive to diversity. Peer dynamics are more complex. They were rated positively overall, but they didn't emerge as predictors of overall perception of inclusion in the regression analysis. Yet our qualitative data shows they do matter profoundly, both in positive moments of belonging and in negative experiences of exclusion. We think it's because, situationally speaking, encounters with peers vary from group to group, from class to class. But when students recall feeling included or excluded, peers are often at the center of those stories. Taken together, these results expose a crucial gap between relational inclusion, the care and recognition students receive interpersonally, and structural inclusion, which depends on how curricular assessments and inclusion policies respond to diversity. But of course, the real question is, what do all these findings mean? How do we make sense of them, not just as numbers and quotes, but as insights into a bigger picture of inclusive pedagogy? In the next part, I'll pull these findings together and show how they point us towards a broader understanding of inclusion, one that highlights both relational dynamics and structural challenges. So one of the clearest takeaways from our study is that inclusion is relational. It's about the quality of relationships in the classroom, the care, responsiveness, and respect that instructors show, the way peers include or exclude each other. And as Anne-Louise Youngblood reminds us, inclusion must be understood as relational and effective, not just structural or policy-driven. That means that as educators, the way we interact with students moment to moment can be just as impactful as the curriculum itself. What does this mean for us as instructors? Our findings suggest that inclusive pedagogy is lived through the everyday relational fabric of teaching, not just through content, not just through policy, but through how we interact with students day to day. Practicing relational pedagogy means building trust, fostering emotional safety, and responding to less visible needs. This could be as simple as noticing when a student is quiet and inviting their perspective, or checking in when someone seems disengaged. Effective inclusive teaching is also about acknowledging diversity, showing empathy, and creating opportunities for all students to contribute, not just the most vocal ones. At a broader level, training should go beyond techniques. It should include inclusive dialogue, affective sensitivity, and awareness of mental health, neurodiversity, and cultural reticence. These are the areas where students told us they felt most unseen. As colleagues Sue and Wood emphasized, learning in higher education ultimately rests on care, reciprocity, and openness. And those things we enact not in policy documents, but in our everyday teaching practice. At the institutional level, inclusion needs to be positioned as central to teaching excellence, not treated as something peripheral to it. First, institutions can scaffold instructor efforts by creating environments that support inclusive peer interaction. For example, through thoughtful group formation, orientation activities, co-curriculars, even residential life. These are all places where students learn to work across difference. Second, instructors themselves need reinforcement. That means ongoing professional development, teaching communities of practice such as these, and performance systems that actively reward inclusive pedagogy. And finally, without these supports, inclusive pedagogy will remain uneven, dependent on individual champions rather than embedded across the university. So let me end by coming back to what inclusion really means for students. It means being acknowledged and invited to contribute. It means experiencing care, patience, and respect from their instructors. It means building trust and belonging through their peers. And it means having courses and assessments that recognize their diverse needs. To put it simply, inclusion is not just about access or even representation. It's about students feeling seen, heard, and supported in their everyday learning environments. That, I think, is the challenge and the invitation for us all in higher education. And with that, we've come to the end of this seminar. Thank you all for listening to us. If you have any questions, we are happy to take them in the chat, or if you feel included enough, you can, of course, unmute yourself or turn on your video camera and then speak to us directly. Whatever makes you feel more comfortable.
Thank you both for the wonderful sharing. I guess I'll just take Daniel's lead and just wait for anyone who would have question or comment to voice out. Thank you. I think Michelle, you have raised your hand. Maybe you could switch on your mic and speak. Thank you.
Yep. Hi. Thank you very much for sharing. It is not a question per se. I just want to share that I think while some students value being called on and actively involved in class discussions, which is something that I normally practice, and because I really hate to give students 0 for participation, right? So sometimes we try to help them by, calling them. But I think that there are some students that are perhaps they feel more comfortable observing quietly. So I do have students who feedback that mentioned that and said, Prof, please don't call me. I really do not want to be cold called. And I think it is quite tough in a sense for academics. On one hand, we want to be supportive of students' learning, and we want to be inclusive in during class time and get everyone to be involved. But there are also students who they just want to be left alone, and we have to recognize that and respect them for that. So thank you. That's just my comment.
Thank you for sharing your experience, Michelle. I totally agree with your observation. I've seen it myself in my classes, and I was one of those students back then who just don't want instructors to call upon me to answer questions. So one thing that I've tried doing in my classes, especially to encourage such students to still actively participate in class, would be to have everyone provide written responses. So at least they have time to think about the question, and also to pair up with at least one other person at their table to discuss. So if they don't feel comfortable speaking up to the whole class, they can at least feel comfortable speaking to at least one other person right next to them. So I think that that has, at least based on my observation, it seems to work effectively. So that's probably something that some of you may want to try in your class as well.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And then also thanks, Darren, for sharing your hands-on experience to it as well. I do think that what you shared definitely resonates with what the students have told us. Yes, some value being actively invited to contribute, but others would rather just be seen and not heard. Or it might appear that way. What this just kind of highlights is that inclusion really isn't one size fits all. There has to be multiple avenues for participation. If it's open discussion, small groups, anonymous platforms, flexible formats, just so that students can engage in ways that feel authentic to them. Yeah, so that's maybe a challenge, and I dare say there's an art to it for inclusive pedagogy, is noticing these differences and responding with some sort of with care and flexibility, I guess. I'm not sure how that can be taught at this point. But I think everyone who is teaching a class actively has probably had to figure out their own ways of negotiating disengagement. And I also wanted to kind of just take this time to acknowledge a comment from, I think, Evelyn in the chat, which is quite similar. It's also about what are the best ways to address disengagement. So I think it definitely came up in the open-ended responses, where students often linked inclusion to whether participation felt meaningful and whether they were acknowledged. So with disengagement, I guess the first step is to kind of ask, is it disengagement from the topic or from the way the space is structured? So just off the top of my head, I think strategies that instructors can use could be like breaking up long lectures, maybe for moments of reflection, giving students choices on how to participate, quick polls like what we did earlier. Just something to help re-engage attention in other ways than just lecturing. And at the same time, it's also important to remember that disengagement isn't always laziness. Sometimes it's stress, mental health, simply being overwhelmed. So I think it could be quite nice to have some sort of check-in after class to specific students. That could make such a big difference to that student. So maybe it's about combining structure with some sort of relational care so that students feel seen because you notice that they're struggling, and opening up space for dialogue. I'm not sure, Darren, if you have any responses to that with from a practical standpoint.
I think you've covered some of the practical tips. Yeah, I don't have much to add at this point. Yeah. Yeah, but I think we have two other questions. So there's one by Anne Wright Zhang Ying. So how do we approach educating lecturers or instructors on this matter? So yeah, so right now this webinar is one way of outreach, to share our findings with instructors so that we can start this conversation. So hopefully we'll have more sharings. I think part of this FLC grant, we've also thought of having more discussion based with instructors across the campus, so that we can brainstorm together about ideas and share with each other the tips from our own experiences and see how we can all be think about inclusion more actively, rather than seeing it as a checklist. Oh, I've done this, I've done that, and just hope that things will work out. Yeah, but we have to consider the more relational aspects and show that we actually care, right? It's not just ticking boxes.
Yeah, also add that I think this webinar is a great start to, I think, the key point of the webinar, that inclusion is or exclusion, right? It's not sometimes overt, it's very subtle in the lived experiences. And so it can be quite contextual. So I think that recognition itself is a great start, that it may differ quite, it may be quite, if I may use the word, subjective, right? And that's also quite interesting, that it can unfold very differently. Yeah.
I also just wanted to add to that, a lot is being put on instructors' shoulders. So it's really not just, I'm hoping at least for some sharing our findings at this webinar, that it's not just about individual instructors trying their best to juggle content, curriculum, and then now we're just laying an additional burden on you all to make sure your students are inclusive. I think it also really does need institutional support. It really does. Whether it's inclusion being framed as part of teaching excellence, there are policies or some sort of scaffolding to help support instructors in some form or fashion, or even just communities like this, that really help to make you not feel like you're this lone ranger trying your best to be a caring and inclusive instructor. I wanted to move on to another question from Jennifer. I think you had a great question on, let's see, it said whether if the research team saw a correlation between the perceptions of inclusion and academic achievement, or in courses that are considered high stakes, and perceptions of inclusion are more positive or negative. So it is a great question. And for this study, we didn't collect any GPAs or performance data, so we can't make any claims of such, but it's definitely something that could be interesting to look into in future research. But also, as mentioned in the beginning, the context of Singapore is meritocratic, very highly competitive. So there is a culture of maybe trying to outgun your classmates. So sometimes that can be seen as a motivation to be inclusive when you have group projects, when the structure supports that. If it's individual assignments, assessments, then you will have students behaving competitively. So that's really enabled sometimes by the environment. So that does call for maybe something a little bit more systemic in terms of change, in terms of cultural shifts, where we can somehow marry inclusion with academic achievement. And I don't think it's an either or thing, where we can all see that we collectively uplift each other together rather than one person flying high, I guess. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Angela had a question about international students, and it was answered by Darren. Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
Yes, yeah, Darren also answered a question from Ming Sui. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Yeah, the study is currently under review. So we are hoping to get it published in the coming months. Fingers crossed.
I think there's one more question from Daisy. Wondering if your team see any potential value in looking into the inclusive pedagogy from educators' perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Darren, that's your question.
Yeah, I guess that there's definitely value in seeing in examining from the educator's perspective to see if they converge, right? So it may turn out that how we view inclusive pedagogy is different from how students view inclusive pedagogy. So I think it would be good to examine them from different perspectives and see whether they converge or diverge, and in what areas do they converge and diverge.
Well, Darren's also being very modest because he's already published a study on this, faculty's attitudes towards inclusive education for university students with SEN though, so not entirely inclusive pedagogy where it's more all-rounded, but I think that can give you some insight. So I'm going to include the link in the chat so you can take a look at it. This was conducted by Darren and another one of our teammates on this study, Dr. Mo Chen.
And this was actually led by a final year psychology student. So it was his final year project.
We still have some minutes left, so I was wondering if others have questions, or perhaps Angela, if you're there, I think you had a question about international students. I know Darren had already answered that, but perhaps if you'd like to, could you just share like some of the worries you have? I think you mentioned you were worried about them. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because like when coming into this talk, I was not thinking international students, but then hearing your data from the students you surveyed got me thinking about international students as like a group that's relevant here. And, I teach one of the ICC modules, CC 0001, where we work with students from across the university. So, and there's been an increase, I think, in students who use translation software throughout the class. And this is a small class, 18 kids in a room. So it's all group work. It's all talking to the students. We talk to them constantly. And, like I just realized in my class I'm teaching that I have a student who's from China, and I thought he was with us. And then he submitted his first assignment and I realized, oh no, I've let him slip through the cracks. He doesn't understand anything that's going on in the class, right? Like he really, he's lost, right? So like I've been, and I don't speak Mandarin. So like, this is the second time I've had a student who I actually, like I can't have a conversation with them because the English proficiency is not there. And I feel terrible, like, and I have colleagues in LCC who are teaching this class as well, and we all really struggle with this because we work really closely with these international students, and we've even tried to make up a sort of like versions of our assignments in Mandarin to share with some students who are really struggling. We've tried having extra workshops during the recess week. But I just don't, it's like I can't, I feel I'm at a loss with these students and I don't know how to help my teachers even, to know the best way forward with it. So I was just, it's just funny because I wasn't thinking of this group until it was the word international came up in your survey. And then I was thinking, oh yes, they are part of this.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, Angela. Yeah,
Yeah.
so we
Thank
did
you.
we did consider these international students, and in one of our analysis that look at demographic differences, we examined whether there's a difference between students whose first language is English or not. And interestingly, we didn't find a significant differences in their perceptions of inclusion across all dimensions, as well as in the overall sense of inclusion. Yeah. But that could be because the percentage of students whose language isn't first, whose first language isn't English, constitute probably a smaller percentage in our sample. That's why we couldn't detect a difference. But I think if we have a larger representation of them, we could possibly see a difference in how they perceive the degree of inclusion.
Yeah. In the qualitative data, the open-ended responses, yeah, some of them do mention cultural and linguistic barriers, and in terms of the ICC modules as well. So those are real issues that do limit their sense of belonging. So what you described is very valuable. I think what the students found helpful was instructors who slowed down, checked if they understood. Not saying that you didn't or didn't do any of these things. It's just that I think it is about forming some sort of relationship. It does come across as like it's a huge chasm to surmount, if someone doesn't even understand the same language. But I think something has to be said and appreciated for the efforts that you are making currently, and even the concern that you're showing right now, to engage such students. And even noticing them is already a huge positive step. Like if you can even like pick out that this student is not even engaged, not even turning in work, that already is a huge step towards helping the student particularly feel included. I think it also helps to engage more people in the class, maybe just to help establish some sort of norms of patience, respect, maybe openness. And students are, from the data at least, have been very open about these things, especially when language is a concern. So I think, I'm not sure if you tried a group project or more group discussions just to see what happens if you can get the student out his or her shell. Yeah, but thank you again for sharing.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for the ideas and
Yeah.
for for recognizing it. It's a struggle. The table mates for the students are great, I find. They will speak Mandarin, they'll like translate what's going on in the classroom. Like I said, there's always a student like once a year who I realize like, oh no. And then I try to slow down and I try to engage and I try to, I find if I have the students do writing, then students who to speak English is very difficult, but to sit and write a bit, they're fine. And even this student sort of slipped over my radar, through my radar, because I had them all do writing on the first day and I collected it, and his was very thoughtful and clear. And I was walking around, I didn't use software for that as far as I could tell. So yeah, it's hard to navigate, but thank you. Thanks for this work. It's great.
Yeah. Thank you.
I know that Michelle has raised her hand, and I think Vanessa also made a comment there. I just want to acknowledge that time has passed. So for those who may be in a hurry to get to lunch, feel free to do so. But if you're keen to stay back for this conversation, I'm sure Darren and Dan will be happy to engage. So perhaps maybe we could go to Michelle first. Okay, your hand is down now. Do you want to
Hi. No, I was just listening to the sharing of Angela just now, and I thought that I just want to share this with Angela and maybe other people who are interested. So for us at Nanyang Business School MBS, right? We have this event called Makan and Lepak with international students. So we invited all the international students, including the exchange students, to join us for an event. So where we will have like ice-breaking kind of games. We do some games with them, and share with them a bit of a Singapore culture, and then we will have like introduce them to our favorite roti prata and curry. So we have quite a number of people who turn up. I think that time we have maybe about 60-ish students turn up. So which is, I think it is quite successful in a sense. And there was another event that we had is called Walk and Connect, which is organized by the accounting divisions of the MBS. And we invited all the year one students as well as new students to MBS to join. So we have about 45 international students and exchange students turn up for the event. So I think that's one way to get them to be involved and engage with the community, the university community. So that's one way. Just sharing with all of you, because we have so many people from different schools, and sometimes we do not really know what each other is doing in other schools. Right.
Thank you for that. Certainly, I think if anything, the study shows that these factors, the structural factors, the lived moment of interaction, they all come together, to provide that sense, that experience of belonging for the student. Okay, so let me see.
I just wanted to respond to that. Is that
okay? Yeah, go on.
No, thanks for sharing, Michelle. That sounds like a great initiative. It resonated with something that came up in the data as well. I think one student in an ICC module felt a bit left out because I think the instructor was Singaporean and then was using a lot of Singaporean terms and didn't know what was going on. So they felt a bit left out in that sense. I think it was an international student that said that. So I think it's just about being mindful, because I thought it was quite an interesting thing that just happened here. Like someone just had to Google lepak, because it's not immediately evident to people who are not from here. So it's good to just take a step back and just explain what these things mean, so that everyone understands and is on the same page, I guess. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And we also had a great comment from Vanessa, who gave a very good study idea to have a classroom observation. Definitely very valuable to complement what we've done already. Yeah, because especially we can get to see what the sense of belonging manifest in terms of tone of voice, body language, instructors, how to invite participation, how do the peers respond to each other, so that at least, I guess, that can create a set of concrete transferable practices that could help everyone.
I think it's almost 12:10, so I'd just like to say thank you everyone for your comments and wonderful questions and ideas. Certainly, I think this study is perhaps one of the first to look at students' perspectives in higher education. So I think we can all build on this and hope that we have a chance to continue to talk about this topic and share our stories of belonging and our pedagogies Okay, I just want to say thank you to Darren as well and Daniel for sharing and also facilitating the conversation in such an what I noticed was quite an inclusive way. So thank you very much. And in the spirit of inclusivity and well-being, let's go for lunch. Okay. So I think my colleague Uni has put the feedback survey there in the chat. With that, I think we can close this webinar. Right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good lunch and a great rest of the day.